Can Robbie and Megan have both talked about demand, and clearly demand is a major factor as we look at these supply chain log jams. And higher demand for many products, particularly in the developed world, is important to understand. So, as was already mentioned, during the pandemic, consumer behaviors changed. People saved money, less travel, less eating out, then decided to spend more money on whether it be home furnishings, home renovations, exercise equipment, electronics. That was a big one as well. So, can you, Ken, talk about the demand and supply imbalance and how you at KPMG help companies look at demand and demand planning?
Yeah, absolutely, Kristen, and thank you for having me. And good morning, good afternoon, all. First and foremost, we're helping companies look at the whole process, from statistical forecasting through how companies collaborate internally and externally with key stakeholders to form what I would call that final demand plan. So it's really important to really define the entire process, and we're helping organizations get a better view of what that process looks like. So we're starting there. We're also looking at the data, as we'll talk about, I'm sure, in this conversation. Data is a big factor, and needing to harness that data the appropriate way, needing to define the right data elements is really important. Absolutely critical from a demand planning perspective to have the right view of item, customer, channel type data that represents the business and a meaningful, what I would call a meaningful set of attributes that help drive correlation and segmentation across different characteristics of a demand channel. So that can have a big impact on the quality of your results if you're performing a demand planning function. So we feel it's important to look at demand variations around factors such as value, volume, seasonality, intermittency, new behaviors that we're seeing, and we'll talk a bit more about that. New product life cycles, right? All of that contributes to a set of item and customer segmentation principles that can really go a long way in helping improve the demand picture if we have awareness of what those characteristics are. So it really speaks to, in our perspective, the fundamental tenet that one size does not fit all, and that certainly rings true from a demand planning perspective, and that we feel through segmentation, companies can really define distinct demand planning strategies that realize the highest the business benefit for that organization. Right? For example, a high value, highly volatile segment of the business might require more of a high touch approach, and you solely can't rely on traditional statistical forecasting type of models. So those are some areas that we're working on. We're also working with customers on the cycle. Right, we believe demand planning review cycles must shrink, and what we see and also what we hear from our clients, monthly cycles, which oftentimes it's still a monthly process. It's not responsive enough to what's happening in the market. Certainly the acceleration of online buying in certain industry sectors and subsectors has changed the way consumers buy product, as well as buy other products along with it, right? So our behavior is shifting. So the digital buying pattern is much more erratic. It's caused a bit more volatility from a demand signal perspective, and so organizations need to be thinking about that as they look at developing a demand planning strategy. Buying influences are also more real time today. Right? You think about what we see, social media platforms, we see from influencers, digital promotions, all of that has an impact on the demand signal as well. So that variability requires more frequent analysis and a much more focused reconciliation of what's being forecasted versus what's actually being ordered. That can have a big impact on an organization and that supply and demand imbalance. So what I would say, that check and adjust type of process needs to happen more frequently. And then the other, I guess the last way that we're helping organizations is really harness the power of some of the advanced technologies that are available, right? There's a lot of conversation today around machine learning, artificial intelligence, and for some that might be that shiny objects that 3, 4, 5 years down the road. There's a lot of really powerful capability out there to help companies move the needle on forecast accuracy, which is somewhat stagnated over the last decade even. And so the e-commerce buying patterns have certainly disrupted that even further, but really looking at your data strategies, looking at how you're leveraging technology to really drive a better picture of demand is absolutely critical. And those are the areas that we're focused on most with our customers.
Great, thank you for that. And we'll be talking more about some of the things you mentioned in your remarks, Ken. So more to come on that. I'm going to stay with Ken for the moment and talk about inventory management, which is, of course, an important part of the picture as well. So this just-in-time inventory management or lean strategies have been in place for many decades, and a number of companies have embraced those with significant success. What we're seeing now is companies, manufacturers, at least some of them, pivoting to more just-in-case strategies instead of just-in-time strategies. How is this transition working? Do you see it as a permanent change? And are there risks associated with tying up too much inventory, capital risks? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. You touch on a good subject for sure. In today's environment, there's optimism in the market, but the optimism is also met with hesitation in lieu of what Robbie talked about, what Megan's talked about as far as disruptions and how industries are impacted by that. So there's hesitation in, I know there's still risk across the supply chain. I'm optimistic that demand is higher and we'll continue to see demand evolve. But how do I protect myself as an organization, right? So inventory certainly becomes one of the first areas that folks consider. It was no surprise to us in one of our recent CEO Outlook surveys. I believe it's around 82% of executives surveyed are very concerned or somewhat concerned with inventory, right? And over half of those are looking to either diversify supply or build inventory stockpiles, right? So it's certainly a top of mind topic. And as you mentioned, right, inventory investment requires capital. There's a balance in today's environment. Not uncommon to have what I would see as more of a hybrid mode. So we've got some where we've got just in time and others where there's just in case. And we're seeing companies opt to invest in larger inventory positions to certainly mitigate the risk of stockouts and lost sales. And so this is a common approach, certainly with what we see across supply and demand and the imbalance that exists today, that's a certainly viable strategy. It's also becoming more common with our global supply chain organizations where disruption, as we've seen, has a much bigger impact. So not without risk. As you mentioned, it ties up capital that can be used for other initiatives, ties up warehouse space. It has a potential to contribute to obsolete inventory and waste in the supply chain, which certainly challenges other environmental concerns as well. And so I think the risk is that for the key areas that we just mentioned is around the waste side of things in terms of how much demand is shifting, right? And so there is a balance of how much inventory am I willing to buy in advance, knowing that my demand will shift. We see what's happening with shelves being empty, containers being delayed at port, that's impacting availability of product. And we all as consumers are making decisions to buy other products in some cases or forego those purchases. And what we don't know quite yet certainly is what the ultimate impact of demand on those goods will be, but we know there will be an impact. And so inventory can help, obviously it certainly can have an impact as well. So yeah, and so my perspective, right, no matter industry, size of company, at the end of the day, inventory planning becomes a critical component to delivering on all of organizations' brand promise. And there are some certain factors that need to be considered. It's not just finished goods that you ought to be considering. It's how do I keep my own production lines and the continuity of production of my own facilities operating, right? So where do I need to invest in other raw materials and in process items to support that? But extremely important topic.
I was reading something in the Boston Globe recently about bookstores struggling with supply and pointing out the fact that for many people who do holiday shopping at the last minute, books are an easy thing to pick up. But books are already in short supply because a lot of them are printed overseas. Right. And there was a bookstore owner saying she just upped all of her orders by 50%, just kind of guessing, didn't know, doesn't know, can't know until we get through the holiday season. But that was her best guess. And books are not exactly easy things to hide. or store. So I think that's just one microcosm of what we're seeing. While on this topic, though, of inventory management, we do hear stories about stockpiling and hoarding and that sort of thing. So Megan, wondering if you can tell us what you're seeing from Intel's perspective. Are you seeing this sort of behavior? And do you think it may last for a while? So Megan, over to you.
Sure. So from an Intel's perspective, we're struggling to get raw materials like substrates, and I heard the other day resin was another one that's struggling. So there's no way we would ever be able to hoard even if we wanted to, because there's such a shortage of what we need. And if I think about it, overall, just in time can work. But then we've seen what happens when the demand picks up and you need something quickly that takes a long time to manufacture. And then even Ken mentioned, with hoarding or just in case type of storage, you're going to have to look at warehousing space. And warehousing space is incredibly tight as it is because of e-commerce looking for more warehousing space for their items too. So in that case, it really doesn't help because it causes shortages in other areas. So to Ken's point, I think good demand planning is the key. There is so much data available at our fingertips now. The lakes of data are just incredible. And I think we need to harness that data and really get better at demand planning.
Thank you. Does either one of Ravi or Ken, any comments on this hoarding thing? I was reading a piece the other day where there was some significant criticism of companies, maybe some companies not admitting to it, but laying in a very significant supply of product, whether component or finished product, in anticipation of what might come. Ravi?
Well, I mean, I was talking to CEO of a consumer products company, and I think they call it pantry filling. It starts with the end consumer. So it's not just the companies that are hoarding, it's the end consumers that are hoarding toilet paper and everything else. And then it sort of ricochets through supply chain. So I think there is some of that panic buying. And this is when a problem gets even worse than it has to be because of this kind of behavior by different players. But if you need a vital raw material, and another company was talking about how they make a lot of shampoo and they need a key ingredient, comes out of China, and without that they can't make it. So one of the responses of companies seems to be premiumization, that is, move up to the higher value added products. So you ration your limited raw material input to put it into the products with the highest margins, which means in the case of cars, you sell the luxury models and with all the options rather than the base models. And likewise, in every product category, there's a way to move up. And so one is hearing about price increases, significant price increases. And that's another topic that I think maybe we need to touch on, is the inflation that we're starting to see, whether that is going to be transitory or not. And there's one camp that thinks a lot of these things will settle down. Like when you take Megan's point that they will have more capacity in 2 to 3 years, that means that is a passing shortage, which hopefully will get worked out. COVID, I think, will take another full year before I think it's gone. So it's end of 2022 before we see that going away. But there's another point of view, and this is again one the CEO of the consumer products company is saying, no way this inflation is transitory. He thinks we're going to see inflation in 2022 and 2023 like we haven't seen in a long time. So, I think the jury is out on that. I do think some of these things, we tend to overreact when we see these events. We tend to think extrapolate from the present too much. We have to be careful not to do that. On the other hand, some trends may be real and may have lasting effect. There are some other broader issues which we have not talked about. And the COVID thing has come on top of those. And one of those is the US-China rivalry. and the uncertainty about what kinds of rules will apply to international trade and investment. And the WTO has been made, much less important. Has lost a lot of its power, and we don't know where that is going. And the rise of nationalism and not if not deglobalization, what some people call a slowbalization or whatever. If that is on the cards, then I think that again has implications for how companies may redesign, reconfigure their supply chains. And that I think is more of a medium-term, long-term issue. The COVID piece of it, I think, will pass, but it's now overlaid on all of those uncertainties. I think, therefore, making for a very difficult environment for companies.
Wow. Thank you, Ravi. There's a lot of stuff in there, some of which we're going to get to in the next few questions, but all of which we won't get to. So more to come on that. One perhaps permanent change, and you've all talked about this, is the importance, need, and usage of data. And that certainly has become more important as e-commerce accelerated. The good news, I think, and we've heard this from member companies at AIM, is that companies have a lot more information now on who their customers are, what they're buying, when they're buying it, what the demographic looks like, what they're buying the product with. And that's pretty valuable stuff. So Ken, I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on how companies can best analyze and use this new data that they're getting from various sources as a result of the pandemic, which, as Ravi said, accelerated a trend that was already continuing.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the acceleration of online buying, I mean, now more than ever, companies are getting access to first-party data, right? Data from their own platforms, their own apps, and we always had surveys and outreaches and things of that nature, but now with the acceleration of online buying, more first data is certainly available. And this is really powerful, right? Because it gives companies insights into each interaction and ultimately the consumer purchasing behavior, which can all be used to, at the end of the day, what's important is shaping that strategy around how to enhance the customer experience. And so first party data is absolutely critical. And with our interactions with our customers, it's clear that companies want to develop what I would call a more insight driven culture from data, right? And recognize that it begins with data. We hear about different data sources, be it first party, so that's the data we're collecting as a customer, or a provider to an end customer. Second party data, traditionally, right, buying data from or getting data from another company who's first party data. Walmart Retail Link's a good example of that. Facebook and Google ads are certainly other good examples of that. And then third party aggregators, right? There's obviously a big push for some of these platforms to not allow third party ads any longer, which is changing the landscape of social media. But certainly all of those are really good sources of information that when used the right way can drive insights and improve decision making. And I think a couple of areas that come to mind and how companies can start to leverage this data, certainly from a marketing perspective and helping create personalized campaigns, targeted outreach, as well as the analytics behind it. How did the campaign work? What message landed? What message did not? So that's certainly an area that organizations, as they go down transforming their marketing function, is looking at data as a big part of that. Operationally, supply chain speaking, we've talked a lot about demand, a lot about supply and demand imbalances. Certainly leveraging first-party data, second-party data, third-party data, all of that data can help drive better insights and factors contributing to a profitable transaction or a profit eroding transaction, right? That, when I fulfilled that order for that customer, did I do it in the most optimal way? And if I didn't, why not, right? So understanding first and foremost that it was not an optimal transaction or an optimal fulfillment strategy, and then understanding the factors that have contributed to that is really powerful. And so being able to leverage data to really look operationally at good performance and bad performance is absolutely imperative. You think about demand, right? We talk a lot about demand on this call, and that you really can provide better insights into a correlation of demand. Was there a demand spike or a demand contraction in my business? And why was that? Was it a supply shortage that drove the contraction? Was there a new store opening or a price increase or decrease that caused a spike or a contraction? And then there's multitudes of variables, right, that you can analyze to really assess impact on demand. So a big part of it is collecting that data and using some tools and technologies to be able to drive insights. The other is to take that data and be able to drive correlations to future events and considerations. So what I am looking at developing a future demand picture, and I know obviously, we can't predict certain disruptions, certainly, but you know how events, you drive promotional events in your business, and the impact of running that event had an impact on your business with a demand increase or decrease for a product or other like products. You can predict what might happen if you run that event again, right? Very, very similar to that is leveraging other data points that you're collecting and how folks are interacting with platforms and what's being marketed with social media to really drive a picture of what could happen in 6 months or 12 months when we know there's going to be additional disruptions or messages that are being broadcast to market. So at the end of the day, certainly data drives insights across the entire journey, the customer journey, I would say, how you attract a customer, how you acquire a customer, how you ultimately serve that customer, how you retain that customer, and how you expand your customer base. And so leveraging that data and really defining critical elements of how data can be leveraged to drive enhanced decision making across all of your functions, be it marketing, be it operations, be it supply chain, be it finance, digital, right, decisions that you're making. Data is a big factor in that.
Okay, thank you for that analysis. I just had a question that got lobbed in, and I think it's important to look at this as well in our discussion today. Labor shortages and the war for talent are a big concern of companies, certainly the ones that AIM hears from. We do a monthly business confidence index. We've done it for several decades, and the common theme is we can't find talent, we can't get talent. Of course, this isn't just a Massachusetts problem, it's a national and actually kind of a global challenge related to what was talked about early on, which is the Great Resignation. Robbie, I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about this labor shortage, persistent, going to go on for a long time. What are some companies doing perhaps to be more clever about finding, retaining employees? As it plays out in supply chain, it's truck drivers, it's warehouse workers, it's dock workers, etc. So over to you, Rob.
Well, I'm not sure we know all the reasons. I think one piece of it is people who are approaching retirement who just decided to, after COVID, either because they had fallen sick or because there was a change in outlook and values and a sense of what am I doing with my last phase of my life, pulling out of the labor force. So that's one piece of it. I think if that happens, a lot of those people probably will not come back. Then you have others who probably are not able to go to work because of something that happened in their personal lives through COVID. After all, we've lost 700,000 Americans have died. It means several people connected to them are affected. And on top of that, you have people who need daycare for their kids, and that was up in the air for a bit. So how much of that is, again, transitory, and how many of those people will come back? We don't know. But this combination, let me step back a bit and say how this spike in demand, which just bounced back much faster than anyone expected, partly because of large amounts of stimulus in the developed countries. The good news is that we've averted a Great Depression. Really, this could have been in another time. This would have led to a global depression of sorts. We learned that you need to stimulate at times like this, both monetary policy, fiscal policy, and we did that in ample measure. Some people would say too much of it, but we did a lot of it. And so that's the reason why we have this problem, which is, I think, a nicer problem to have than the opposite, where your prices falling, factories shutting down, people losing jobs, and economy is not able to get out of a hole. So now the question is, how can we live in a world in which maybe there will be fewer people at work? So I think you'll see productivity going up, investments in technology going up. Some of the things Ken is talking about are AI, for instance, could increase the productivity. You're seeing even in McDonald's today, you go in there, you can order online. Something is being done widely in countries like China for some time. It's now catching on in the US. So I think there'll be some adaptation on the part of companies. But in the short term, they're having to pay more. They're having to be nicer to employees. there's much more attention, from what I can tell, to taking care of employees and making them feel wanted. And it's not just money, but also a sense of being valued. And those, I think, are good for if someone from the employee perspective. That's a nice development. I think some of that will continue until we know the answer to how many people are going to come back and how quickly companies can embrace technology to deal with these challenges.
Thank you. So while on this topic, I'm going to jump now to Megan, because to Robbie's point about needing to pay employees more to hire them, to retain them, Megan, in one of our earlier calls, had called out a concern that she's looking at related to supply chain regarding the longshoreman contract. So Megan, do you want to talk a little bit about that, please?
Sure. So, we're all seeing huge port congestion at the moment, a lot of it due to many, many factors, as we've all mentioned. But coming up, and I believe the longshoremen, which is the Longshore and Warehouse Union contract, so they work on the West Coast, that's coming up to be renewed in July, I believe. And, they haven't started working on this contract yet and negotiating with the union, from what I'm understanding. And the last time it took 10 months to close. So, on top of all of these port congestions, we find this longshoreman agreement coming up as well. And we're all wondering how that is going to impact us as well. So we've been working on that, looking at alternatives to going into those ports and what we can do around that. So it's a tricky time, and it's understandable. The shipping markets are making a lot of money, so people would like a bit of that money too, right? So it's only human. So it's going to be an interesting negotiation. So I think we're all watching that space.
Kristen, can I jump in and ask the fellow panelists a question? Because I've heard from a few companies that container costs have gone up by a factor of 10 or even more. Can you explain why that's happening?
Okay,
and
who wants to jump in here? Ken or
and is it again temporary, or is it how long will it take before? I know there is some price gouging maybe going on. I know there's some attempt to make up for lost profits and so on, but 10x?
Yeah,
I
right.
think it's more than Ken, just to say more than 10x. I mean, I believe the most recent figure I heard is that it's $20,000. It was $20,000 in August or September, which is more than 100% increase from even just earlier in 2021. So Ken, talk more about that.
Yeah, I mean, in simplest terms, it is a supply and demand problem, right? I think the demand is higher than the supply, and there's a lot of jockeying for spots on cargo ships, right? And then that hence drives a price increase. And yes, I think there's an element of that, certainly that's the original foundation of what we're finding. And yeah, is there a bit of gouging? Yeah, I mean, maybe so. I think that there's certainly some conversation around that, right? So I think looking at, demand is a big part of the farther you can get in front of demand, and secure spots is certainly a way to help, manage and mitigate the price. But there's I was reading an article just the other day, thinking about the large companies versus small companies, and, smaller organizations that maybe don't have relationships and contracts with the three major ocean-going vessels, which even I think there's 7 or 10 that occupy 85% of the capacity. So it's a pretty small group that organizations need to consult with, and so starting to either develop relationships with third-party providers and freight forwarders is a big part of how organizations can manage the cost structures. To a degree, and getting ahead of what their needs are. Certainly, we talked about the supply and demand imbalance that exists, and not knowing what the changing behaviors. We talked about inventory, all of those things that organizations ought to be looking at. At the end of the day, the customer buys what the customer buys, right? So there's risk in what we see across the supply chain. But from a container perspective, there is a capacity issue certainly that's driving most of that.